Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Pragmatic EDH. Today, we're going to be discussing something more along the philosophical lines, as the next couple episodes will tend to be. We'll probably get more into the nitty gritty of other things like deck building and strategy later on, but before we get into the video, feel free to hop into the comments, give me any sort of ideas you may want to hear about in the future. I've got a pretty good list right now set up, but I'd love to hear what you guys think. So, in this episode, we are going to be discussing how to properly self assess and define the different approaches to power level in Commander. Now, this can be a little bit of a touchy subject. There are a lot of different ways to measure power that are out there, and we're going to be discussing kind of the validity of each one and how we can properly apply that to our own deck building and ways to play ourselves so that we can properly enjoy a game of Commander. In modern Commander, there are about two really accepted trains of thought about what exactly Commander power level is defined by. And they're really just metrics, not necessarily anything definite or concrete. It's usually a self imposed rating one gives to their deck in usually comparison to other decks that they play with in their own groups, and that's fine. That can be perfectly useful. But we're looking for something a little more concrete than that. But we will quickly be going through all of the different really accepted types because thankfully it'll be a short list as there's two. The first one is the 1 to 10 scaling. The 1 to 10 scaling has been around for an extremely long time. I started playing Commander back in 2012. Even back then, the Power 10 scale was used as a common measurement for people when they sat down at a table and had table talk. Unlike now, where it's got a lot more to it and asking about things like combos, speed, several different factors. Table talk is the act of discussing the power level of decks kind of prior to a game's start and using it as a jumping off point for deciding maybe what deck, if you have several, you'll be bringing to a table to ensure a really healthy and fun gameplay. In the past, the Power 10 scale was used as a way to measure an overall deck's power, one being a deck that actively functions against itself or creates its own detriment through its own play. These are really uncommon, or they tend to have some sort of theme to them. Think decks that try and follow a specific theme of a show, or they're trying to accomplish something silly, like use only camels. Things where there's art specific, they tend to be more fun. Where 10 is competitive EDH or competitive Commander, which is a subset of Commander used to describe decks that are incredibly powerful, very potent, and highly consistent. They're often played together as pods, and usually, as we talked about in the last video, this would be considered pub stomping, or this would be something that's kind of breaking the social contract because usually these kinds of decks want to use those kind of effects. Now, the major issue with the 1 to 10 scale and why it's kind of been phased out in the past couple years is because people's ability to self assess their decks has become kind of clouded due to rose colored glasses, as I think I said earlier, about their own builds. Like, no one wants to have a bad deck, obviously, but sometimes you do. And coming to grips with that is something that's important as someone who would build a deck as much as it's someone to play a deck. So there's nothing wrong inherently with having a weaker deck, but saying that, oh, this is my strongest deck and saying your deck is strong is not the same as having a generically strong deck. And that's why the Power 10 scale was phased out. As the description of saying my deck is a 7 out of 10 was very common. And the 7 out of 10 really added nothing and created no actual information useful that you could possibly take into a game and say, all right, based on this knowledge, what can I do with this? Who can I play against? What power level am I dealing with? How can I avoid creating an unfun game by being too strong or way too weak? And that was kind of why the Power 10 scale has been phased out. The other more common or prevalent way that people have been describing decks recently in terms of their power level in a game or prior to a game has to do with a grouping of descriptions that range from casual to competitive, and it's kind of varied depending on where you're at, but it's definitely a little bit more lenient than the 1 to 10 scale. This is more modernly what you'll see. Still, it's semi-inaccurate because misrepresentation is always a concern, and it will always be something that will plague the format as long as there are no such thing as deck checks, which is fine. The 5 different levels of power in this measurement are known as unfocused decks, which are really, think like 1 to 3. You've got the focus decks, which are kind of 3, 4, and 5. It's kind of a toss-up. You've got tuned, 5, 6, and 7. Optimized, 7, 8, 9. And then competitive, which is 8, 9, 10. And I'm kind of intermingling the numbers there because there is kind of a weird fringe line on some of those numbers where it's really hard to tell exactly what power level they're at, because sometimes you can just get great hands, and that's absolutely something that makes Commander awesome, is you just have such high variability between games. The big problem with these descriptions is they are almost too general rather than being too specific. It's like giving everything the description of being power level 7 within that power level. It's fine. It's functional. It causes table talk. I like all these things. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. However, I think that there is a way that you can be more specific in terms of how you can possibly describe power levels for individual decks without really having to go into, well, I'm going to reveal my strategy and get hated out unfairly because it may be something somewhat strong. Now, the reason I bring this up is often people tend to dislike the discussion of power levels as seeing decks as good or bad inherently is really against the feeling or spirit of Commander, and that's not necessarily where we want to be at. So, finding ways to just assign some sort of value or some sort of number to a deck or to a playstyle, what have you, is really good at keeping the format feeling mysterious, I suppose, would be the way I'd describe it. But what it helps also do is helps lower the number of crappy games people are inevitably going to get stuck in. And I can think of many times where I've just been stuck in some miserable slog of a game because somebody was untruthful or somebody was being squeamish about answering questions about their power level, and we ended up in a really long game where everyone was frustrated because the proper deck level powers were not discussed properly. In response to this, and why I bring all this up and discuss about why we're trying to find maybe something better, is because I have discussed with several of my friends online, several of my buddies in paper, and some of my family members who even play Commander about different power levels and how to properly define them. And the ways that we've really come up with as a total grouping has to do with the efficiency of a deck versus its density of spells or effects. And what I mean by that is basically how many things can you do with as little resources as possible. And the reason this matters is it really shows what a deck is capable of when really far behind or on the back foot. A good way to understand this is looking at a deck that has a bunch of 1 mana value cards that advance their game plan with things like card draw, ramp, removal, or enablement of other things in the deck, versus a deck that has very few of those cards, or has cards that are those mana value but do very little to advance the board for themselves. And the reason this matters is I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. I think both power level systems are equally useful, but being able to give some sort of answer beyond specific card names when questioned about the power level of your deck is really nice for being able to kind of keep what's going on in your deck a bit of a secret, or really when you're not dealing with established metas, at keeping the games fun and nonpartisan, so that way you can perform your probably fair game plan to whatever outcome you really want to achieve. Now, with all things, as we've discussed power level, there are certainly strategies that we've talked about in the last video that are inherently more powerful and susceptible to power level conversations than others. Things that go against the usual expected game plan of a deck of playing cards from hand, using 1 or 2 spells a turn, or creating a mana amount equal to the number of lands and maybe 1 or 2 artifacts that you can generate will inherently be stronger if you can do more than that, or inherently weaker if you do less than that. And unfortunately, something that dictates this ability to do these kind of things is actually your commander itself. Now, there's a lot we can dive into in discussing the power level of a deck versus the power level of its commander, and how those things tend to dictate each other, and how outside influences based on the average deck of a commander influences people's play patterns towards a specific deck, regardless of its actual intention. The long and short of that is basically your commander can really decide how a game will go for you, and how people will treat you as a threat. Continue on the topic of commanders. Commanders that do something that is readily accessible or easy to do throughout a deck, or enable a strategy that the deck tries to do, often tend to have something called synergy or a good interaction with the deck. Now, basically, synergy is a commonly used term in Commander that talks about a deck's ability to interact with itself in a positive manner that forwards your own game state. And what I mean by game state is your place in the game gets farther ahead than you were before. Therefore, knowing this, having a high amount of synergy in a deck will make your deck much stronger than a deck with low synergy. Now, defining a level of synergy is a level of complexity that is entirely unnecessary for a general topic description video of power level. We will get into that later as we get farther down the rabbit hole of strengthening, powering up, and making your deck more functional in a wider variety of games. So as we dive back into the relevance of commanders and power levels and their kind of discrepancies, has to do with the different types of ability a commander provides to a deck. And the reason that this matters so much is having access to a card in a 99 card singleton random format allows a deck to function simply off of a commander alone. And it's a card that you'll have access to every single game, and it's basically the only one you can guarantee. So that's what makes it so incredibly important. So having an extremely powerful card in your command zone is also going to allow you to do extremely powerful things with the rest of your deck, regardless of the actual power level of the cards in your hand, as you will be able to do many different synergistic things like cost reduction, gaining value, or repeating spells and effects. Commanders that don't provide this level of value tend to be labeled as weaker due to either getting pushed out of the meta by getting a better version of themselves made, or providing less value overall with the synergies that the deck wants to use. Things like under-supported synergies and or weaker versions of effects can also be a limiting factor towards specific commanders and their actual power level. The reason all this kind of talk of commanders and power levels in general, indecisiveness in the actual measurement of deck power and power levels, is due to the state of Commander entering I would say, a fairly happy place at the moment. When people say average power level 7 on the old scale, or they say that most decks are focused or tuned, is really true. That's not a bad thing, and even in the past, it was really common to find a bunch of players at shops who really had very weak, unfocused, very low power decks. Like the old precons even were very weak and unfocused themselves, so they were meant to provide a toolkit for a deck to be built, rather than having something close to a completed product out of the box. And this has created a fairly healthy environment for play, where most of the time you can sit down at any table and really bring out any deck you want, barring something like competitive or something that violates the social contract as a strategy. So what this means for you and I comes down to talking about expected power levels versus known power levels. And so what I mean by that is an average hand will provide you with what versus your best hand providing you with what. So looking from a very specific perspective of saying, well, if you were going to keep a hand, what would it be, assuming you didn't have your best cards in them? And then providing a table with information of, oh, well, this deck, usually wants to make plays by turn 2 or 3 happen, versus a deck that's like, well, I really want to make plays happen by turn 4 or 5. is a really big difference, and the speed of a deck really does define where it can sit comfortably against other opponents. That's not to say that casting spells or doing things is really the only measure of a power level of a deck, because you could be doing lots of weak things, but being able to do lots of weak things at a table that are all doing equally weak things as something later on is still fairly strong. A great example of this would be a commander that makes tokens all the time versus a commander that makes a token once in a while. So the one that does it once in a while, though it may be a stronger token, you'll kind of beat them in density. But that's not to say the one token can necessarily be better than all the other tokens put together. It's just a matter of defining how, when, what, and why. Thank you everybody for tuning into episode 2. It's been a pleasure having you, and stay pragmatic.